Hello, part 3 of 6, introducing the link services and proxy API. In this one we're going to look at a scenario where we've got an external service, and I'm going to focus the entire video on looking at what that external service is, how it's put together and what it does. Okay, so I'm going to switch to my code window. There we go. Okay. Right. So all I've done here is I've created a new .NET Core, ASP.NET Core version 6 scaffolded web API thing. And I've added a couple of little things to it to do a different kind of security, to just basically do an old legacy style API key authentication mechanism. So I've basically got an example controller. I'll start with the controllers. I've got an example controller that is at /API test. It's a get method that just returns a message about who I am and what the date and time is. But then I've also got this thing called a transaction controller, and none of this is particularly best practice code. It's not even remotely thread safe. You would never really hold your data in a dictionary that gets reset every time you restart the server, but you get the idea. It's just an example where we're going to be basically getting a list of the most recent 5 transactions that have been recorded against some entity with an ID, and also be able to post into that a transaction that has a folio. So look at the model. A transaction consists of a folio, so just some text, and a delta amount. And when we ask it for the list of transactions, we get back this transaction list response for the specific entity we've requested. And we're just basically saying in there, we're going to look at all the data that we've got, and we're going to return the most recently added 5 rows, along with a total row count of how many rows we've actually got, along with a balance, which is just a sum of the delta. So I can get to that with /API transactions, the ID of some entity, and that will give me back that list. And I can also post to the same URL, and it will effectively add 1 transaction to the list. Let's try and have a look at that in Postman then. So before I do that, I need to explain the authentication mechanism. So those are the controllers. In the actual setup of the application, there's some things going on to do with cores, which I'll come back to in a minute, but all of this is standard boilerplate stuff that would be scaffolded by the .NET New console application. The only thing that we've added to this is a new authentication scheme. So we're adding authentication of type API token with this API token handler. Now, all that's doing is it's deciding how it should handle, if I go back to one of the controllers, anything that's got this authorize against it, how it should handle the authorization to allow that to happen. If you don't meet the expectations that are set in the API token handler, it will not allow you to call that API. You get a 401 response. Let's just have a really quick look at how that works. We're basically saying here it's this handle authenticate async method that we've implemented against the authentication handler type. And what we're basically doing here is we're looking at the request to say, do we have a header of a given type? And the header needs to be X custom auth. If we don't have a header, we're basically going to fail authentication. It's going to receive a 401. We're then going to say you might have set the auth header, but you might have set it to an empty value. If the empty value isn't there, then again, we're going to give you a 401 response. Then we're going to validate the token. Obviously, you wouldn't do this in a hard-coded way, and you would have some mechanism to go and invalidate certain tokens and stuff. So these would be in a database somewhere or something like that. But we're basically saying if the value of that custom auth header is not a real API token, and the other thing with the token is, of course, with it being an API key, you would have it quite long and very, very randomized. But anyway, if the header is not a real API token, we're just going to fail the authentication result there as well, and that's going to give you a 401. Otherwise, if you pass all of those checks, so you've set a token, it's not empty, and it matches what we're expecting, then we're going to set up and say this is the identity that you will be for this particular request, and it's just setting up an identity that says I am called API key user. So that returns API or authentication result a success, which says yes, you're valid, which will then allow the controller, whatever it is, to actually execute and return its values. So let's have a really quick look at that in Postman. Okay, so I've got here a request. I'm going to be, in fact, what I need to do is run this first. So I'm going to run this from VS Code. I'm just going to go .NET run. Okay, that's my API running. So now I'll go up to Postman, and I've set it up to run on localhost 7100. So I'm going to call that test controller that just gives us a message. But in the headers, I'm just going to let it send some standard headers, but I'm not going to send this X custom auth one that it's expecting. So if I send that, you'll see the response I get is 401 unauthorized. I'm not actually allowed to call it. If I do decide to send it, but I send a blank value, what happens? I get a 401 not authorized. If I send something that's an incorrect value, I get 401 not authorized. But if I send the expected value, then I get an actual response, which is the message with my name in it, which we hard-coded to API key user, and the time. So I'll just run that a few times. You can see it's giving me a new response each time. So that's the test API. Let's have a look at this other stuff. So this is where we're working with the transactions. So here I'm calling /API transactions, and then I've just created a random GUID. And when I send that, I should get back a list of all the transactions that I've got. So I'm getting back rows empty, total row count is 0, and the balance is 0. I've also set up another test, which is to post into that same URL. So you can see again, I'm going to the exact same URL with the exact same GUID. I'm passing in the custom auth token. When I send this, I'm sending this with a body. So the model, if you remember, just switch back to the code, the model that I'm sending in to post is this transaction, folio and delta, that's then going to be added into that in-memory dictionary of data keyed by the ID of the thing. So that's my ID of the thing is 2D74D blah blah, and I'm sending in from Postman with a delta of 1.27. So I'll send that. I got a 200 response. It's happy with that. I'll send another one in, which is 1.73. Send that in. I've now recorded 2 transactions. If I go back to my get method and run this again, it now gets me the 2 things that I've just added, and my balance is 3, total row count is 2. That is largely it for this demo. I just wanted to show you the API that we're going to be looking at integrating to. In the next one, we're going to look at the common issues of calling this API from both the UI and from workflow and stuff, and look at then, that'll set the scene for how we can overcome the issues using the link services system and the proxy API. I'm planning on putting all of the code for this, for the service and anything that we're about to develop in the IDE and stuff up on GitHub, which will be linked somewhere below in the article body content. Okay, see you on the next one.